The glow of my phone cut through the dim hospital hallway, its cold light landing on a message that made my stomach drop. My daughter was slipping away just a few doors down, her breaths thin and uneven, yet all I could see in that moment was the selfishness dripping from the words her husband had sent me. It felt like the air thinned around me, the world narrowing into a single, devastating truth I wasn't ready to face. If you've ever trusted someone who didn't deserve it, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more quietly than you'd believe. As I stood there, torn between heartbreak and a rising sense of dread, I had no idea that message was only the beginning. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the way my phone lit up in that dim hospital hallway. I had stepped out for a moment to breathe, to steady myself, to gather the strength I needed to walk back into the room where my daughter was slipping away. And then I saw his name on my screen, my son-in-law, the man my family had trusted for years. I opened the message expecting some sign of concern or gratitude or even basic human decency. Instead, I found a note so cold it seemed to drain the air from my lungs. In that instant, something inside me cracked. It felt as if the walls around my understanding of our family shifted, exposing a truth I had somehow missed for far too long. I stood there staring at the screen, feeling the hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the distant beeping of machines in rooms I wished I could trade places with. My daughter was fighting for the last pieces of her life just a few doors down, and all he could think about was himself. I felt an ache spread through my chest, but beneath it, something sharper was forming, a quiet realization that this moment was not an accident. It was a glimpse of something deeper, something far darker than simple selfishness. As I turned to walk back toward her room, the gravity of everything settled into my bones. I knew this message would mark the beginning of a truth I could no longer ignore. And to understand how we reached that hallway, that moment, I have to go back 3 weeks earlier, back to when the first cracks began to show. 3 weeks before that moment in the hallway, I was sitting beside my daughter in a small exam room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and winter air drifting in from the cracked window. I had spent nearly my entire career as a nurse, and I knew the look on a doctor's face when hope had quietly stepped aside. When he spoke, I felt the world tilt. Even though I'd spent a lifetime preparing other families for news just like it. Hearing that my own child was running out of time pulled something out of me I didn't know I still had. Hannah took the news with a steady grace that both amazed and shattered me. She asked questions about timelines, comfort measures, and the boys' routines. It was the kind of brave practicality that made me wonder how she had grown into someone so strong without me ever noticing the exact moment it happened. Meanwhile, I sat there gripping her hand, trying to keep my face calm while every part of me wanted to scream. It felt surreal to sit there as her mother and as a nurse, balancing those roles as if either one could save her. Even then, little things around the edges felt wrong. Her husband, Daniel, didn't come to that appointment. He sent a message saying work couldn't wait, and at the time I tried to convince myself it was just terrible timing. Later that day, when he finally walked into the house with that distracted, half-present energy, I felt the first twinge of unease I couldn't quite explain. There was a distance in him, subtle, but sharp enough to scratch at my instincts. Looking back, that appointment was the start of everything unraveling. And as the days unfolded, Daniel's behavior only grew stranger, tugging at something deep in my gut that refused to quiet down. In the days after Hannah's diagnosis, I kept waiting for something in Daniel to soften, some sign that the shock had finally reached him, but instead of leaning in, he seemed to drift further away, almost as if her illness were an inconvenience he didn't have the time or emotional bandwidth to deal with. I watched him move through the house with a kind of hollow efficiency, his eyes always somewhere else, his mind locked onto something I couldn't see. While I spent my hours helping Hannah manage her symptoms and keeping the boys' routine steady, he buried himself in what he kept calling planning. He stayed up late at the kitchen table with his laptop open, tapping at spreadsheets and documents, barely acknowledging anything happening around him. I would pass by on the way to refill a water pitcher or bring Hannah her medication, and he would barely look up. It was as if the emotional weight of what we were facing simply didn't land on him the way it did on the rest of us. Part of me tried to be generous. I told myself everyone grieves differently, everyone copes differently. I reminded myself that not all fear looks like tears or trembling hands. But another part of me, an older, quieter instinct, kept nudging at my ribs, telling me something was off. Even when Hannah needed small things, like help settling into bed or a gentle meal prepared with care, he always seemed to have a reason why he couldn't step in. Work deadlines, calls he couldn't miss, documents he needed to finish. I could feel a tension building beneath the surface, a steady hum I couldn't shake. Every time I tried to brush it aside, it only grew louder. And as the days passed, more signs appeared. Small, unsettling details that hinted his distance wasn't just emotional. Something else was taking shape behind it. And I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever it wasn't good. It didn't take long before the uneasiness I'd been trying to ignore began to take on a sharper shape. Little things around the house started to shift, almost too quietly to notice at first. Daniel spent more time tucked away in his home office with the door nearly closed, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment I walked by. I'd hear the faint rumble of his conversations, and every now and then a stray phrase would slip through, words like timing, adjustments, and moving things forward. None of it sounded like a man focused on comforting his wife or supporting his family through the darkest moment of their lives. One afternoon, I stopped by the house earlier than usual with a stack of Hannah's favorite magazines. As I stepped inside, I heard him talking with someone on the phone. His tone was different, brisk, calculated, almost urgent. I paused in the hallway, feeling torn between respecting his privacy and listening for something that might make sense of the growing dread in my chest. I heard him mention narrowing windows and the need to move to another phase sooner rather than later. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. It didn't sound like business. It sounded like strategy. When Hannah later asked if he seemed stressed, I couldn't bring myself to say what I'd heard. She still believed he was trying to keep the household afloat, still saw him as the man she had loved for years. I couldn't put the weight of my suspicion onto her already tired shoulders. So I smiled, reassured her as best I could, and carried the guilt with me instead. But from that moment on, the feeling never left me. It settled in, heavy and persistent, whispering that something terrible was moving beneath the surface. And as the days crept closer to the end, that whisper only grew louder, warning me that the worst was yet to come. The last morning of Hannah's life still sits in my memory like a photograph I never asked to keep. The room was quiet except for the soft rhythm of her breathing, each rise and fall growing lighter, as if her body were slowly releasing its hold on the world. I sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, trying to keep my hands steady. Years of nursing had taught me what these moments looked like, but nothing had prepared me for what it felt like when it was my own child. I whispered every comforting thought I could muster, even though I knew she was already drifting somewhere I couldn't follow. What struck me most during those final days wasn't the pain of losing her. It was the widening gap between what she needed and the man who should have been holding her hand. Daniel was barely present. He moved around her room as if he were checking off tasks rather than saying goodbye. He ran errands that didn't need running, made calls that didn't need making, and slipped out of the house for long stretches without explanation. Each time he returned, he looked more irritated than heartbroken, like grief was something he resented being expected to participate in. When Hannah slipped away just after 7:15 a.m., it felt like the world stopped. The boys clung to me with a fear they didn't have words for, and I held them as tightly as I could, trying to be strong when the ground beneath me felt like it had collapsed. Daniel stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes dry. I couldn't understand it, but I also didn't have the emotional strength to question it. On the day of the funeral, he claimed he had to leave early to handle a sudden family emergency, but he never showed up at the service. Not once did I see his car, his face, or even a message explaining why he couldn't stand beside his own children as they said goodbye to their mother. The truth came later that evening, when a call informed me he had been found across town with another woman and arrested after a public altercation. In that moment, every uneasy feeling I'd buried became undeniable. Whatever was happening behind the scenes was far darker than neglect or selfishness, and I knew then that the danger had only just begun. In the days after the funeral, all I wanted was to keep the boys close. They were the last pieces of Hannah I could still hold, and being near them gave me a sense of purpose when everything else felt unbearably hollow. But almost immediately, Daniel made that harder than it should have been. He stopped answering my calls, brushed off my offers to help, and acted as though my presence was some kind of intrusion. At first, I tried to be patient. Grief can twist people into versions of themselves they barely recognize. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that this wasn't grief. This was control. He moved the boys into the woman's house, the same woman he'd been with the day of the funeral, and he did it without a second thought. No warning, no conversation, no concern for how disruptive it would be for two children who had just lost their mother. When I gently asked about weekend visits, he told me the boys needed stability, and apparently that meant limiting contact with me. The way he said it felt rehearsed, as if he'd already decided I was a threat to whatever new life he was building. The moment that changed everything came one afternoon when I happened to be near the school. I saw the boys walking to the car with Daniel and the woman. The older one glanced back, and when he saw me, his whole face lit up, then immediately fell when Daniel grabbed his shoulder and steered him forward. That small gesture, that flicker of fear, pierced straight through me. Children don't hide their instincts. They don't pretend when they feel unsafe. Standing there on the sidewalk, watching them disappear into a car that suddenly felt far too dangerous, I understood something I had been trying not to admit. This wasn't just distance or selfishness. This was a pattern, a deliberate one. And if I didn't start fighting for them now, I might not get another chance. There comes a moment when the quiet warnings inside you become too loud to ignore. For me, That moment arrived one night as I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at a photo of Hannah holding the boys at a summer fair. I realized I had been tiptoeing around the truth, trying to convince myself that grief made people act strangely. But the pattern was too deliberate, the timing too sharp. I couldn't shake the fear that if I didn't act soon, the boys might end up in the same kind of danger their mother had faced without even knowing it. That was the night I hired a private investigator. When I met him, I shared everything I had held inside for weeks. Every odd phone call, every financial document I had glimpsed, every shift in Daniel's behavior. Speaking it aloud felt wrong at first, like I was betraying Hannah. But soon it felt like the first honest thing I had done since she passed. He listened carefully, took notes, and assured me that he would look into every lead without making assumptions. The discoveries came in pieces, each one landing heavier than the last. First was the insurance policy, a newly updated document naming Daniel as the sole beneficiary, adjusted just months before the diagnosis. Then came the information about the woman he had been with at the funeral. She wasn't just a new partner. She had a background in pharmacology, with access to substances the average person wouldn't even know existed. And finally, the investigator obtained the toxicology report from the hospital. At first glance, it looked ordinary, buried in medical terminology. But when he explained the elevated levels of certain compounds, ones inconsistent with Hannah's treatments, I felt the room tilt. The truth settled over me like ice. My daughter had not simply lost a battle with cancer. Someone had helped her lose it. Someone who stood to gain from her death. My grief turned into something sharper, an urgent, focused determination. I knew then that whatever happened next, I had to protect the boys and make sure the truth came to light. And the next step would be confronting the two people responsible. The morning of the confrontation, I felt a kind of stillness settle over me. It wasn't calm, exactly. More like the quiet just before a storm breaks open. I knew what was about to happen, and I knew I needed to be present not for myself, but for the boys. I drove to the neighborhood park where Daniel often took them on weekends, the investigator's words echoing in my mind, every piece of evidence now woven into a truth I could no longer unsee. When I arrived, I spotted them near the picnic tables. The boys were chasing each other through the grass, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Daniel and the woman sat together on a bench, talking as if they were any other couple enjoying a sunny morning. The sight of their ease made something coil tight inside me. I stayed back, close enough to step in if needed, but far enough not to alert them. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my palms. Then it happened. A line of unmarked cars pulled up along the curb, and officers stepped out with a quiet efficiency that cut through the air like a blade. In a matter of seconds, the park shifted from ordinary to surreal. I watched Daniel stand up in confusion, then panic as the officers closed in. The woman tried to back away, but another officer intercepted her. The boys froze, their laughter collapsing into fear as handcuffs clicked into place. Instinct took over. I ran to them, gathering them against me as they trembled and asked what was happening. I told them they were safe, that I was there, that I wouldn't let anything happen to them. Even as chaos unfolded around us, holding them felt like anchoring myself to the one part of this story worth fighting for. When the officers handed me the emergency custody paperwork, I signed without hesitation. It wasn't the end. Not yet. But it was the moment the boys were finally out of danger, and the path to justice truly began. The day of the sentencing felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I sat in the courtroom with the boys beside me, their small hands wrapped around mine. When the judge read the verdict, I watched Daniel's face for any sign of regret, any flicker of the man he once pretended to be. There was nothing. The same emptiness I had seen during Hannah's final days. His accomplice showed more reaction than he did. Anger, fear, something human. But for him, it was just the end of a plan that had finally collapsed. When the gavel fell, the older boy let out a shaky breath. He leaned into me and whispered that he felt safe now. And hearing those words broke something in me in the gentlest way. After months of fear, confusion, and loss, he finally felt protected. That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay. A few days later, we visited Hannah's grave together. The boys brought drawings they had made, and I laid fresh flowers at the stone. I told her justice had been served, that her sons were safe, and that I would raise them with every ounce of love she left behind. The wind felt softer that afternoon, as if the world had shifted into something kinder. The insurance payout arrived weeks later, and I set it aside in accounts for the boys' future. Our days are quieter now, a new routine, a new beginning shaped by resilience instead of fear. We laugh more, we breathe easier. And as I stand here sharing this story, I want to ask you, have you ever faced a moment that forced you to find strength you didn't know you had? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.